Etta Wren owned 2 dresses, and she was wearing the good one, the one with a patch at the hem stitched so carefully that most folks never noticed it. She stood at the edge of the Larkspur County Social with her hands folded in front of her, watching lantern light move across a floor she had scrubbed that same afternoon for $2 and a sack of cornmeal. She was 22 years old. She had kept herself since she was 16, the year the fever took her mother and her father rode west looking for work. He never found, or never wrote home about. She had never learned which. She kept house for the Judson family 3 days a week. She mended saddles at the livery on 2 more. On the 7th day, she rested only because her body left her no choice in the matter. Her hands were rough enough to catch on silk. Her boots had been resoled by her own needle more times than she cared to count. She owned no land, no cattle, no father to speak for her at a wedding, no mother to have taught her which fork to use at a supper like this one. She was watching Cole Whitfield across the room, and she was doing it the careful way a person watches something they have already decided they have no right to want. Cole ran 4,000 acres along the Brazos and had never once, in the 3 years she had known him, looked past her the way the other ranchers' sons did. He tipped his hat. He asked after her health. He remembered, somehow, that she took her coffee black and kept her Sundays quiet. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. It meant nothing, she told herself. A decent man was decent to everyone, and she had learned a long time ago not to mistake ordinary kindness for something more. Mistaking it had cost girls poorer than her a great deal more than one night's disappointment. Larkspur, Texas sat where the Brazos bent hard to the east, a town of 600 souls, 2 churches, a mercantile, and enough gossip to fill a courthouse twice over. Everybody in it knew everybody's business, and everybody's business, as far as it concerned Etta Wren, could be summed up in a single sentence the town had settled on years before. She was the girl with nothing. Nothing but a rented room above the harness shop and a reputation, hard-won, for working harder than anyone had a right to expect from a person that size. She had not always been poor. Her father had owned a small spread outside town before the drought of '74, ate through 3 seasons of grass, and then through the cattle themselves. She still remembered the sound of it, if a drought could be said to have a sound, the creak of a windmill turning over nothing, the low complaint of cattle standing too thin in a dry pen. He had sold what remained for a fraction of its worth, buried his wife the following winter in a plot he could barely afford a stone for, and left the following spring with a promise to send for Etta once he had found steady ground somewhere west. Maybe New Mexico, maybe further. The letter never came. She had been 16. She had told herself for the first year that grief travels slow through the mail, that a man building a new life from nothing did not always have a spare hour for writing. She had stopped telling herself that sometime around her 18th birthday, and she had stopped watching the road into town for a writer who never came, though it took her the better part of another year to admit she had stopped. She worked. That was the whole of her strategy for surviving a world that had not asked whether she wanted to survive it. She scrubbed the Judsons' floors and hemmed their curtains and taught their youngest to read a little on the side, though nobody paid her for that part. She kept the books straight at the livery, in exchange for a roof over the harness shop and enough left over, most months, for flour and coffee, and the occasional length of ribbon she never quite let herself buy. She had a gift, though she would have been the last person in Larkspur to call it that. She noticed people. She noticed old Amos Whitfield, Cole's uncle, sitting alone on his porch 3 winters running after his wife passed, and she took to walking the long way home, so she could stop and read the newspaper to him, since his eyes had gone bad, and his pride would not let him admit it to anyone who might tell Cole. She noticed the Hartigan boy limping behind the other children at the schoolyard, favoring his right side the way a person favors a hurt that has gone on so long it starts to look like a habit instead of an injury. She knelt down in the dust one afternoon and asked to see his boot, and the boy, embarrassed, told her it was nothing, the same word Amos Whitfield used about his own eyes. She worked the boot off anyway, gently, and found the seam cut wrong along the inside arch, cramping his foot with every step he had taken for the better part of a month. She fixed it herself that evening with a scrap of leather and an hour she did not particularly have to spare. and she said nothing about it to his mother, who found out only when the boy came home running for the first time in weeks. She noticed when a family went quiet at church, the particular quiet that meant a cupboard had gone bare, and she left baskets on porches at hours when nobody would see her do it. She had precious little to give. She gave what she had anyway, which people who have never been poor sometimes mistake for an easy thing, and which people who have been poor know is the hardest kind of giving there is, because it costs you something you cannot easily replace. Loretta Prescott had money enough to replace anything twice over. The Prescotts ran the largest spread in the county, and Loretta had been raised from the cradle understanding that she would one day marry well, in the particular sense that word carried among families like hers. She had set her sights on Cole Whitfield the winter she turned 19, and most of Larkspur considered the matter as good as settled, since a Prescott daughter did not generally set her sights on something she failed to acquire. Loretta was not cruel in the showy way some rich girls are cruel. She was cruel the way a closed door is cruel, simply by being there, simply by being the shape the whole town had already decided the future was going to take. She had a habit of speaking to Etta with a particular gentleness, the gentleness a person uses on something they consider beneath the trouble of unkindness. Once, outside the mercantile, she had looked at the hem of Etta's dress, the good one, the patched one, and said, with real warmth in her voice, that Etta was so resourceful, making do the way she did. It was not meant as an insult. It landed like one anyway, the way the truest cruelties usually do. Etta had made her peace with the shape of her own future a long time before that social. She was not going to marry a rancher's son. She was going to keep house and mend saddles and read the newspaper to old Amos Whitfield until either her hands or her eyes gave out, and she was going to do it with as much dignity as a woman in her position could manage, which she had decided was quite a lot actually, once a person stopped waiting for anyone's permission to have it. So when Cole crossed the social room that evening and asked her to dance, she said no. She said it kindly, with a small smile that cost her more than he could have known. Her feet were tired from the scrubbing, she told him, which was true, though not the whole truth. He looked at her a moment longer than the answer required, as though he suspected there was a second reason folded up inside the first one, but he did not press her on it. The whole truth was that she had watched Loretta Prescott watching them both from across the room, watched it the way a person watches a fire they are trying to decide whether to put out. And Etta knew exactly what one dance would cost her in whispers the following week at the mercantile. She had decided a long time ago that she would rather carry her own dignity home intact than borrow one evening of somebody else's world and spend the next year paying for it. Cole did not press her. He never pressed anyone. He simply pulled out the chair beside hers, the empty one nobody else had claimed, and sat down and talked with her for the better part of an hour about nothing in particular, about the spring calving, and a dog he was training, and a book he had been reading that he could not make heads or tails of, and she found herself laughing twice, which she had not expected to do that night at all. Loretta watched the whole thing from across the room with an expression that did not move an inch, which was, in its way, the loudest thing in it. Amos Whitfield fell ill in the third week of March. It came on fast, the way it does with old men, a chest cold that turned to something worse within 4 days. His housekeeper had quit the previous autumn and never been replaced, since Amos insisted, loudly and often, that he needed no looking after. Cole was 2 days out on a cattle drive when word reached town, and it was Etta, walking her long way home from the livery, who found the old man's lamp still burning at an hour it had no business burning, and let herself in to check on him, the way she had let herself check on him for 3 winters running. She stayed. Nobody asked her to. She simply stayed, because Amos Whitfield had nobody else in that house, and a fever climbing by the hour, and because leaving him alone in that condition was not a thing Etta Wren was built to do, whatever it cost her in wages or reputation or sleep. She sat up with him 4 straight nights. She spooned broth into him when his hands shook too badly to hold the bowl himself. She sponged his forehead with well water at 2 in the morning and read to him from the newspaper in a low voice when the fever made him restless. On the 3rd night his mind wandered somewhere she could not follow him, and he called her by his late wife's name, and asked her, with a clarity that frightened her more than the fever had, whether the north pasture had been mowed before the rain came in. Etta told him it had. She had no idea whether it had or not. She only knew that a dying man's questions deserved kind answers, whatever the truth of the matter, and she sat with his hand in hers until the delirium passed and he slept easier for it. On the fifth morning, when his eyes finally cleared and found her sitting in the chair beside his bed with dark circles under her own, he took her hand in his again, this time with his senses fully returned to him, and said her name like he was surprised to remember it belonged to somebody real. She had missed 4 days of wages doing it. She did not once mention that fact to anyone, not even to herself in any way that counted. Cole came home on the 6th day to find his uncle sitting up in bed, color back in his face, insisting he was fine and had been fine the whole while, and it took the old man exactly 1 glass of buttermilk to admit, grudgingly, exactly who had kept him alive that week. Cole rode to the harness shop that same afternoon. He found Etta at the counter, sleeves rolled, hands stained with saddle oil, and he stood in the doorway for a long moment before he said anything at all. The bell over the door had rung when he came in, and she had looked up expecting a customer, and something crossed her face when she saw it was him, quickly hidden, that he pretended not to notice out of a kindness she would not have thanked him for at the time. He asked her plainly whether it was true, that she had sat up 4 nights running with a sick old man who was not even kin to her. She said it was true, though she said it the way a person admits to something ordinary, a chore finished, a debt settled, nothing more. He walked her home that evening, since her shift at the harness shop had run late and the light was already going out of the sky over the Brazos. They did not talk much on the way, which suited them both. Near the turn by the schoolhouse he asked her, out of nowhere it seemed, whether she had ever wanted to leave Larkspur, to try her luck somewhere a person's whole life was not already decided for them by the time they turned 20. She thought about it longer than he expected her to. She told him no, not really, because leaving would have meant leaving Amos and the Judson children and the Hartigan boy and all the small threads she had spent 6 years quietly tying herself into. And a person did not walk away from threads like that, just because the town attached to them had never thought much of her. He did not say anything for a while after that. When they reached the harness shop, he tipped his hat the way he always did, and told her he would see her Sunday, and she stood in the doorway a long moment after he had gone, telling herself firmly that a man walking a woman home on a quiet evening meant nothing at all, and believing it a good deal less than she had the week before. We're now at about the halfway point of this story, so if you're hooked, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything, and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. He asked her why she had never told anyone. She said there had not seemed to be a reason to. He asked her what she wanted, for the trouble, for the nights, for the wages she had lost, and she looked at him like the question genuinely confused her, because it had not once occurred to her that kindness was the sort of thing a person invoiced. That was the moment, though neither of them named it as such at the time, when Cole Whitfield stopped seeing Etta Wren as the quiet girl who mended saddles and started seeing her as something closer to the center of his own life than he had let himself admit before. He began finding reasons to ride past the harness shop. He began sitting with Amos on Sunday afternoons. At the same hour Etta came to read the paper, which everyone in town noticed within a fortnight, because everyone in Larkspur noticed everything. Eventually, Loretta Prescott noticed fastest of all. She began appearing at the Whitfield place with baskets of her own, pies and preserves put together by her mother's cook, and presented as though she had stood over the stove herself. And she began speaking of Cole in town, with a possessive warmth that had not been there before, the warmth of a woman defending a claim she felt slipping through her fingers. She mentioned, more than once, at church and at the mercantile both, that she and Cole had an understanding, a word she used with enough weight that most of Larkspur assumed it settled and true, though Cole himself had never once used the word in front of anyone. She was not wrong to feel her claim slipping. She simply could not see why, since in her accounting nothing about Etta Wren had changed. Etta still had no land. Etta still had 2 dresses and a rented room, and hands too rough for silk. What Loretta could not see, because her whole life had trained her not to look for it, was that none of that had ever been what Cole was weighing, and had never once been the sort of thing he kept a ledger on. The county fair fell in the 2nd week of June, and the whole of Larkspur turned out for it. Church committees and ranch families and the Prescotts in their finest, taking up 2 full tables under the big oak by the judging tent. There were pie contests and a horse auction and a fiddle player who had come up from San Antonio for the occasion, and for one afternoon a year the whole county set its ordinary business aside and pretended, for a few hours, to be one single happy town instead of a collection of families who mostly kept to their own fences. Etta came because Amos insisted on it, and because he insisted further that she sit with him at his table rather than help serve at the church booth the way she usually did, and she agreed, mostly because refusing an 80-year-old man who had nearly died in her arms 3 months prior felt like a cruelty she was not capable of. She wore her good dress. She had let out the hem herself the week before, carefully, so the patch would not show, and she had told herself twice on the walkover that she looked perfectly presentable, which was true, and had nothing at all to do with the reason her hands kept smoothing the front of her skirt. It was Loretta who started it, in the end, though she would have said afterward that she was only speaking a truth everyone else was too polite to say. She had watched Cole cross the fairground twice that afternoon to check on Etta and the old man, and something in her had finally given way. She said it loud enough for the tables nearby to hear, which was, everyone understood later, exactly her intention. She said that some people ought to know their place, that a girl with nothing to bring to a marriage but a mending needle had no business turning the head of a man who could have anything, anyone, in the whole of the county. She said the word nothing with a particular weight, the way a person says a word they have been saving. The fairground went quiet in the way a room goes quiet when everyone has heard something they were not supposed to hear said out loud. Somewhere near the pie tables a spoon stopped moving midair. The fiddle player, who had not heard the words but felt the silence roll toward him, let his bow drift to a stop as well. Etta felt her face go hot. She did not have a speech ready, because she had never once, in 6 years of being poor in a town that never let her forget it, prepared a speech for a moment like this one. She had spent those 6 years learning how to be quiet about the wrong things done to her, not how to answer them out loud in front of 200 people. She only had the truth, plain and unrehearsed, and after a moment she stood, because sitting through it felt worse than saying it, and because Amos had reached over and pressed her hand once, briefly, the way a person presses a hand to say, "Go on, I am right here." She said that Loretta was right. She said it quietly, without any fight in her voice, which surprised the people close enough to hear it more than an angry answer would have. She said she had nothing. No land, no cattle, no name that opened doors, nothing but 2 hands that knew how to work, and a needle that knew how to mend. And she was not ashamed of that, but she understood plainly enough that it was not the kind of nothing a woman offered a man like Cole Whitfield. She turned to him then, in front of the whole fairground, in front of the Prescotts and the church committees and old Amos gripping his cane with both hands, and she said the only honest thing she had left to say, the same words she had turned over in her own mind on 100 quiet nights and never once said aloud until this one. "I have nothing to offer you, Cole." She said his name soft, the way a person says a name they have decided. Finally, they are allowed to say once and then let go of. Cole Whitfield did not hesitate the way Etta had braced herself for him to hesitate. He crossed the space between them in 4 steps, the same unhurried way he crossed a room, and he took both her rough, work-stained hands in his, in front of everyone, in front of Loretta Prescott and her mother's cook's pies, and the whole judging tent gone silent as a held breath. "You have the kindest heart in Texas," he said. He said it plain, the way he said most things, without any flourish to it, which made it land harder than a speech would have. He said he had watched her walk her long way home for 3 winters, just to read a lonesome old man his newspaper. He said he had watched her lose 4 days of wages nursing his uncle back from the edge of dying, and never once mention it, never once let it be known, because it had never once occurred to her that it was the sort of thing a person mentioned. He said he had land enough for 2 people, and cattle enough for 2 people, and neither of those things had ever once kept him warm on a hard winter night. But a woman who gave away what little she had without keeping count of it, that was a different matter entirely. That was the kind of wealth a man could actually build a life on. He said the only thing Larkspur had ever gotten wrong about Etta Wren was the arithmetic. She did not have nothing. She had never had nothing. She had simply had the one thing that could not be counted on a ledger, the one thing no drought could take and no inheritance could buy, and he intended to spend the rest of his life being the beneficiary of it, if she would let him. He said he did not care one bit what the fairground thought of the arithmetic either, since he had done his own sums a long while back and come out the richer man by a wide margin. Old Amos Whitfield, from his chair, said the only thing left to say. He said he would be switched if he was going to sit here and watch his own nephew talk circles around a proposal, and would somebody please fetch the boy a ring before the fair ended. It broke the silence the way a laugh breaks a held breath, and the fairground let it out all at once, and somewhere in the middle of the laughing Loretta Prescott turned and walked to her family's table and did not come back to that part of the fairground again. Etta did not answer him with a speech either. She answered him the way she answered most things in her life, plainly and with her hands, by turning her own hands over inside his, until they were holding each other properly, and she said yes in a voice not much louder than the one she had used to say I have nothing, which was, Cole told her later, the moment he understood for certain that everyone in Larkspur had been looking at her wrong for 6 straight years. They were married that September at the small church on the river road, the one Etta's mother had been married in a generation before. She wore a new dress for the occasion, her third, sewn by her own hand from cloth Cole had bought her that she had, after a great deal of arguing, finally allowed him to buy. She kept the argument going right up until the morning of the fitting, insisting she could make do with the good dress and a new collar, and Cole had simply set the bolt of cloth on the harness shop counter and told her plainly that a man was allowed to buy his own wife a wedding dress without it being charity, and that had been the end of the matter. Old Amos gave her away, since he had appointed himself her family the moment he understood he did not have one of his own left to spare, and he cried through the whole ceremony without any pretense of hiding it, dabbing at his eyes with a handkerchief that had clearly been packed for exactly that purpose. The Judsons came, the livery owner came, and closed his shop for the first Sunday afternoon in 11 years to do it. Half the porches Etta had left baskets on over the years came too, family by family, though she had never once told anyone which porches those had been, and she never did find out how they knew, except that Larkspur, for all its gossip, had a way of remembering the kindnesses done to it just as thoroughly as the ones it failed to do in return. She kept mending saddles for a while after the wedding, out of habit more than necessity, until Cole gently pointed out that she no longer needed the wages, and she gently pointed out that she had never done it only for the wages, and the two of them settled, as they settled most things, on a compromise neither had quite proposed at the outset. She kept reading the newspaper to Amos on Sunday afternoons for the rest of his life, right up until the winter he passed peacefully in the same chair he had nearly died in 3 years before, with her hand in his, and Cole standing in the doorway the way he had stood the first afternoon he came looking for her at the harness shop counter. His last clear words, spoken to Etta a few days before, were that she had been the finest thing to ever walk into that house, family by blood or otherwise, and that he had known it the moment she first sat down beside his sickbed without being asked. Loretta Prescott married a rancher from the next county over within the year, a good enough match by the accounting Larkspur had always used, and if the town ever noticed that Cole Whitfield had built the finer life, the fuller one, the one people actually wanted to sit inside of on a Sunday evening, nobody was unkind enough to say so out loud in front of her. Etta Wren, who had once stood at the edge of a social with 2 dresses to her name and no father to speak for her, became, in time, the woman half of Larkspur came to when their own cupboards ran bare, since she never forgot what an empty cupboard felt like and never let pride keep her from filling one quietly. The Hartigan boy grew up straight-backed and even-tempered, and told the story for years afterward of the woman who had knelt in the schoolyard dust to fix his boot without ever once making him feel small for needing it fixed. She raised 3 children in the house. Cole built her along the Brazos, and she taught every one of them, the way nobody had ever needed to teach her, that the things worth having in this life are rarely the things a ledger knows how to count. Her eldest daughter grew up watching her mother read the newspaper aloud to whichever neighbor needed the company that season, and grew up, in turn, to do the very same thing without anyone having to ask her twice. On quiet evenings Etta would sit on the porch with Cole, while the sun went down over land that was, finally, hers as much as his, and she would think back sometimes to the girl standing at the edge of that fairground saying I have nothing to offer you, and she would think that the girl had been wrong about almost everything except the honesty of saying it out loud, and that the honesty, in the end, had been worth more than anything Loretta Prescott's family ever owned. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.